we begin with a meeting that could change the war in Ukraine. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has arrived in Washington, where he will meet U.S. President Biden. They're expected to discuss allowing Ukraine greater control over Western-supplied long-range missiles. Kyiv has been pressing its allies for months to provide more powerful weapons with fewer restrictions to be able to strike deep inside Russia. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned the West that the use of long-range arms will cross a red line and mean that NATO is at war with Russia.
Kyiv is adamant it cannot reduce the Russian threat until the U.S. lifts restrictions on the use of Western-supplied long-range weapons. Ukraine says it wants to hit Russian airfields, missile launchers, and command and control centers deep inside Russian territory. But U.S. restrictions on the use of long-range weapons means Kyiv cannot easily achieve this goal.
Prolonging this process of lifting long-range restrictions leads to Russia moving these military targets deeper into Russian territory. Therefore, if the restrictions from partners are removed, I really wanted it to be a strategy for Ukraine's victory, and not a political strategy.
The shaded area here shows the Russian border regions of Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod, all of which are within range of the US-supplied HIMARS missile launchers that Ukraine already has. But almost all of Russia's military and air bases are beyond that. Ukraine wants to use longer-range weapons like advanced ATACMS that can reach targets up to 170 kilometers away. That would make it harder for Russia to protect the air bases from which it launches most of its air attacks on Ukraine's cities and infrastructure. There are also ATACMS within a 300-kilometer range, which could threaten even more Russian assets. Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned an approval of long-range arms by NATO would mean an escalation.
This is their direct involvement, and this, of course, would, in a significant way, change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict. It would mean that NATO countries, the United States, European countries, are at war with Russia.
US President Joe Biden is wary of provoking a nuclear conflict with Russia, but he appears to be willing to let Ukraine deploy British and French missiles using US technology, but not US-made missiles themselves. Lifting the restriction on British and French missiles could still be a huge help to Ukraine.
Well, for more, I'm joined now by Thomas Graham. He served on the National Security Staff for U.S. President George W. Bush. He is now a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Affairs. He specializes in Russian foreign policy. His book, Getting Russia Right, looks at the challenges and pitfalls of U.S.-Russian relations and how to get it to a better place. Mr. Graham joins me tonight from New York. Mr. Graham, it's good to have you on the program.
Glad to be.
U.S. President Biden is expected to lift some, if not all, restrictions on weapons, long-range missiles used by Ukraine against Russia, possibly as early as this evening. He has been firm in his refusal to give Kyiv the green light to attack deep inside Russia. How do you explain this apparent Biden change or pivot?
Well, in fact, this really follows a pattern that we've seen throughout the administration during the course of this war. They have put limits on what the weapon systems they were going to provide Ukraine, but eventually they provide them, whether it be Abrams tanks, F-16s, ATACMS missiles, and so forth. So in many ways, a decision to ease the restrictions on the use of these weapons would follow in that pattern. It is an indication that the administration feels more comfortable with how Russia will respond and think that by providing this authorization, that they aren't going to cross a red line and lead to a devastating retaliation or escalation by President Putin.
I want to ask you about the situation right now in Kursk. There are reports tonight that Russian forces have retaken parts of the Kursk region. We can't confirm that, but if it is true, it will mark a military disaster for Ukraine. I know you have written that the Kursk incursion was a dangerous diversion. And a military analyst told me today that this has been a complete waste of resources and soldiers for Ukraine. Should this be a reason then for Biden to pause and perhaps leave things as is for the moment regarding weapons?
Well, I don't think that would be a reason to leave things as is regarding weapons. The use of weapons for deep strikes in Russia is not connected with the Kursk incursion in any direct sense of the word. It really is the Ukrainians' effort to attack sites in Russia that are used for launching military assaults, aerial assaults on Ukraine in the eastern part of Ukraine. So what the Ukrainians want, and I think what the Biden administration will authorize, is the use of those weapons against airfields, clearly defined military targets inside Russia that have been used for basing strikes against Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin's red line is long-range missiles used by Ukraine deep inside Russia. He says if that were to take place, it would pull NATO into the war. Is it in NATO's interest, is it in the interest of the United States to cross this red line, to call his bluff?
Well, look, we've had this conversation about red lines for a long, long time. We have crossed several lines without disastrous consequences. We don't know where the real red line is. All that said, if we're going to go down this route, we need to be quite confident that we're prepared to deal with whatever response Putin might come up with. And he can do many, many different things. The focus, much of the conversation in the West has been on the use of tactical nuclear weapons. I think that's unlikely, but certainly he could arm proxies that could attack NATO, U.S. assets elsewhere in the world. He could launch a massive cyber attack against targets in Europe or in the United States, something that he has refrained from doing up to this point. And of course, he could also expand the campaign of sabotage against infrastructure in Europe that we've seen evolve and develop over the past several months.
What do you think is the most likely scenario if we take nuclear weapons out of the equation? Do you think it's arming proxies to launch perhaps terrorist attacks on NATO interests, U.S. interests around the world?
I think that is probably the most likely scenario at this point, and doing this perhaps even in conjunction with the Iranians and using them as a conduit to groups like the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, that might be inclined to attack American assets abroad. But I also think we ought to look seriously at the use of cyber weapons and attacks against critical infrastructure in Europe and the United States. One thing that we have to be worried about in the United States in the weeks ahead as we move towards a presidential election is a cyber assault intended to, in fact, compromise that election in some way.
Yeah, that brings me to my last question for you. I have to ask you about this, the U.S. presidential election, Harris or Trump. If the result leads to violence, if we see another January 6th riot, for example, will this not be the perfect outcome for Vladimir Putin and his Ukrainian plans?
Certainly, this is something that President Putin would be quite happy with. Disruption in the United States, anything that tarnishes the image of the United States as a democratic power, anything that complicates its ability to develop and execute an effective policy is to his advantage. He looks for disruption. He will do what he possibly can through cyber means to encourage that type of disruption in the United States in the weeks ahead.
Thomas Graham with the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Graham, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this Friday. We appreciate your valuable analysis. Thank you.
Well, for more now, let's go to DW Special Correspondent Aya Ibrahim in Washington, D.C. Aya, how likely is it looking that the U.S. will agree with Britain to letting Ukraine use these long-range missiles to hit Russia?
It's difficult to tell what the final decision is going to be, and we have heard from White House officials that no, it's unlikely that there will be an official announcement made today. But what we know for sure is that it is very important for the United Kingdom to have a coordinated response between Western allies who have been supporting Ukraine. And as you mentioned, the top of the segment, now these long-range missiles that are in question, while they are British, they have American parts, and so the United States would have to agree if they were to be deployed in a different way in the war. But it's difficult to really tell which side this decision will eventually land on.
Now, Vladimir Putin has also been paying attention. He warned against the West supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine. He even suggested that Russia might expand the war and hit NATO targets if they do. How serious is that threat?
Well, it's important to remember that similar threats are not new coming from the Russian president. And certainly if we consider the rhetoric within the Russian propaganda space, we've heard variations of this before. Every time there's sort of an impending or decision by Western allies to help Ukraine in a different way or in a way that might be perceived as strengthening it more than support that the West had been supplying up until that point. With that being said, it's difficult to really tell if this is a bluff or there might be anything behind it. And remember, direct conflict with NATO countries may not be the only way that Russia could respond to something like this. They could start sort of wreaking havoc in other parts of the world, getting in the way of Western interests. For example, one could imagine that they may start supplying the Houthis with weapons, for example. Now, this is all just speculation, but a direct conflict with a country that is a member of NATO, which would be a major escalation, may not be the only way that Putin would respond should this decision come to pass. And should Western allies now decide that Western weapons would be allowed to strike targets within Russian territory, deep within Russian territory, because so far Western weapons have been used, but sort of at cross-border fighting, but not deeper into Russian territory. That's what the decision, this current decision, would be about.
And coming up ahead of this meeting, Biden was asked about these threats from Putin. He said, "I don't think much about Vladimir Putin." Do you think that that's true, or is he just bluffing?
Again, very difficult to really go inside the thought process of the U.S. president, but of course he has to project strength in the face of such a leader who has defied the United States and its allies multiple times and is actively working against its interests. But of course, I mean, the fact that the UK Prime Minister is here and that these deliberations are going on, and that when there are similar decisions coming up, Western allies have to deliberate with each other. That tells you that there's, of course, a lot of risks that have to be weighed before a final decision is made. But again, it's very difficult to know exactly what the president sitting in the White House might be thinking right now.
DW Special Correspondent Ibrahim in Washington, thank you.